Negatively yielding bonds are a curious phenomenon. Investment-grade munis are considered a risk-off asset class. How and when to use the tool is just as important as the tool itself. High-yield bonds, known as junk bonds, tend to move in high correlation to the equity market. This is a face-off Rieger report video on 2 intermediate municipal bond exchange-traded funds, or ETFs. As always, consult with your financial advisor. Should be one of your first steps. This is J.R. Rieger of the Rieger Report, and I'm really pleased today to have with me today John Hallacy, a well-known and respected municipal bond analyst with many years of experience, giving us his insights today. Welcome, John.
It's a pleasure to be here, J.R.
Great to have you. Hey, John, do the states require additional assistance beyond what is provided in the CARES Act? And how do you prevent the aid from being applied to pension payments?
Well, I mean, clearly the states need as much help as they can get right now. The CARES Act had $150 billion plus additional monies for Medicaid, which of course states largely carry out. The most recent estimates are that the shortfall is as much as $650 billion for states. That is a National Association of State Budget Officers figure. I did an article, The $1 Trillion Question, maybe 10 days ago, and there it talked about, basically most states, with exceptions, are missing out on upwards of a third of their revenue for the year, which is just an insurmountable number. So yeah, I think something more needs to be done. I don't know if $1 trillion's the right number or 950 or whatever, however you want to slice it, but certainly my figure in my report was no less than 250 billion, and certainly something more than that would certainly help stabilize the states. We're not talking about making them robust. We're trying to stabilize them. And, pension payments often are upwards of, well, they can be as much as 10% of the budget, and often rival the amount that is dedicated to the repayment of long-term debt. Long-term debt is also usually in the range of, 5 to 10%, give or take, depending on the state, of course. So it is a major obligation, but, my feeling is the state aid shouldn't be held up just because of the pension problem. I mean, you can do some kind of carve out if need be, but the rest of the budget just isn't coming back that fast.
And now we've seen downturns before, John. How have the states, particularly the ones that are on the bubble of being stressed, handled previous downturns?
Well, the first thing that stops is all travel and all, they take a look at the capital budget and go forward only with projects that absolutely need to be done for public health and safety. And then they start looking at the employee roster. And this whole concept is essential, non-essential. I don't necessarily like those labels because anybody working should be considered essential to a degree. But they'll take a look at that and say, well, are we going to have to furlough some people? Are we going to have to offer early retirement to some folks? And or will we have to resort to layoffs? Just to wrap up with the early retirements, sometimes that can backfire because it can wind up costing more in the near term than anticipated.
Excellent point. So we shouldn't be seeing any Brooklyn bridges come up for sale in the near term.
No, but the remarkable aspect of this market is, as stressed as we are, the muni market is delivering buyers to issuers. I mean, the MTA got a deal done, Illinois got a deal done. I mean, this is pretty remarkable given the environment we're in and given how stressed those two credits are.
Yeah, the demand for municipal bonds has been quite strong and yields are really quite low. Should we be seeing a rebound there?
Well, I think at some point, but right now the 10-year AAA is just around 1%. Of course, the Treasury's at 62 basis points. And the long end AAA is just around 2. And these are pretty remarkable levels. I mean, if you told me a few years ago that I'd be getting 2% in 30 years, I mean, I would have said, what? There's no risk? So I think eventually rates will head up, but it's going to be a while.
Now, the Treasury's been borrowing a lot, and it looks like it's going to have to borrow some more going forward. Does that have a negative ripple effect into the other bond markets?
Well, certainly the health of the Treasury borrowings are very important and kind of set the overall tone for all of the fixed income markets. And clearly, if Treasuries were starting to encounter some turbulence, that would not reflect as well on the so-called sister markets. But so far, demand, despite all, remains relatively strong. I just wonder what, if anything, will change that, because there just is so much to be done. The other aspect is we always look at corporate treasury ratios, muni to treasury ratios, and the ratios at these levels become somewhat meaningless. You almost have to abandon that analysis.
Yeah, well, I certainly think the old school ratio of U.S. Treasury, munis to U.S. Treasury, is so skewed it becomes meaningless now.
Yeah.
But I still compare AAA munis, really high grade munis, to Apple and Microsoft bonds, just to see whether there is some spread in there for either side. And I'm not seeing a lot of incremental value for buying AAA munis relative to buying a taxable corporate bond, even at the highest tax bracket. So it is a unique market.
Yeah, it really depends if you're an individual or an institution or an SMA or what kind of buyer you are, and just how security conscious you are.
Absolutely. John, let's shift to the bond ratings agencies. We're beginning to see downgrades. What does your view look like in the near term as these ratings changes begin to get announced?
Well, I think to a certain extent, you can always expect somewhat of a knee-jerk response. But in fairness, rating agencies have somewhat of a tough job right now, because they're trying to give issuers time to make their plans, to balance their budgets and make changes accordingly. But at the same time, they got to reflect reality. And one of the challenges in the municipal realm has always been timeliness of financial reports. We get an annual audit usually 6 months after the end of the fiscal year, and most states and localities don't do real interim financial reporting, unless they're going to market, when they have to disclose. And even then, of course, it's unaudited and subject to a lot of changes and adjustments. Healthcare is one part of the market that generally reports quarterly, so somewhat more in step with what goes on in the corporate side. So that is a little difficult as well, because right now, if I were at a rating agency, which I have been for quite a few years, and you did as well, I would certainly try to really hone in on the cash flows and what does a monthly cash flow look like. And that's not always something that's readily available to the public. I'm not saying people withhold it, it's just they don't always offer it, especially if you're not borrowing short term. However, with the spikes in short term borrowing that will go on, we might see some more cash flow reporting.
It's also not easy for the general public to understand that data, even if they were able to get their hands on it. Some of the municipal bond issues are actually quite complicated, right?
Well, I'm not going to say it's not dense. How do you think I got this lovely gray hair? It certainly takes time to become accustomed to reading municipal financial reports. I mean, they basically are in accordance with fund accounting, which is quite a bit different from corporate accounting. I mean, still GAAP in most instances, but very different formats.
Right. I was looking at one that's a mall project, and I'm trying to understand it more, and I'm finding it to be quite complex at the moment.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is generally enterprise accounting is somewhat closer to corporate accounting. When you get a revenue stream, and that aspect looks somewhat similar, but the fund accounting is where it's really, really different.
Hey, John, Thanks for coming on the Rieger Report today. How can people reach you directly?
Thanks, JR. Either jjhallacy@gmail.com. That's HALLACY. And phone is fine too, 917-273-9292.
Hey, I'd like to thank John Hallacy, our guest expert today on the municipal bond market, for joining the Rieger Report. This has been JR Rieger, and this is a Rieger Report interview.